Tonight, as I mentioned earlier, we're moving on to the fifth point of the 7 points of mind training. And Jamgon Kongtrul, once again, calls that the extent of proficiency in mind training. And Trailing Kabgan says measuring the success of mind training. And both of those, to me, have kind of a accomplishing things kind of feel to it. And I really don't think that that is the intention. I do think it's kind of natural sometimes to wonder, how am I doing? I'm spending time and energy with this practice. I've been doing a lot of reading. How can I tell if it's having an effect in my life? Not for the purpose of either pulling out the confetti or for beating ourselves up, but just as a check and a measure. Do I need to do something differently than I am? If I'm not having anything I can see that's different, if I'm the same as I always was, why am I doing this? And perhaps I need to shift. So, I mean, that's part of the reason for these slogans and this measuring the success. The way Trailing Kabgan, again, puts it at the very beginning of his chapter, we may want to assess our mind training practice from time to time in order to evaluate our progress. The 4 slogans contained in this point are dedicated to measuring our progress on the path by establishing whether our minds are becoming more other-centered or whether they are simply mired in more subtle habitual perceptions of the world. We need a balanced approach to this Lojong point, because an obsessive concern over our progress is just another form of fixation, while failing to attend to it at all is equally detrimental. And both of those would, of course, come from some form of ego clinging. He continues, committing these sayings to memory will make them a self-regulatory aspect of our practice. Each of these slogans is a pithy, succinct, often enigmatic saying that reveals its depths through repeated contemplation, which is true of all the slogans we've already looked at. None of them have been, hey, let's read it once, now I got it, we'll move on, I don't have to think about it again. All of them are reflect, we hear it, we read it, we think about it, we apply it to our own lives and how it might work that way, and gradually it becomes deep and a part of us, and it comes up naturally in the course of our daily life, rather than something that's sort of separate from us that we have to, I guess I better think about the Dharma. It no longer has to do that. It just begins to flow in of its own accord. So the 4, they are known as the 4 methods of appraisal for evaluating our ability to exchange self for others on the Lojong path. So he goes directly to our compassion, the exchange of self and other, Don Glenn, the breaking down of the walls, the softening of the separation. That's what we're trying to take a measure of. So the 4 of them are, and I'll just sort of briefly say what they are, then maybe talk about 1 or 2 of them. And I'll be saying them as they're translated here. The first one is, all instructions have one aim. The second one is, 2 testimonies rely on the important one. The third one is, a joyous state of mind is a constant support. And the fourth is proficiency, means you do it even when distracted. So those are the four. That's the only four slogans in this fifth point. And they are a little enigmatic. If you haven't heard them before, all instructions have one aim. If you haven't read this recently and you don't recall exactly what they're talking about, just take a moment and wonder what that one aim might be. I know we have a lot of experienced hands here at the moment that have maybe done this once or twice or four times or more previously and have a pretty good idea of what's being said. But it's an interesting reflection, to, if you weren't thinking about that, what would you say that, if somebody says to you, so what's the main deal about Buddhism? What's the main aim of that? Well, there's the Four Noble Truths, end of suffering, so on. So here is what Jamgon Kongtrul has to say about it. Since the aim of all Dharma is simply to tame ego clinging, as you practice Dharma or work on mind training, ego clinging should decrease. That is pretty straightforward. In a world where very often we go off in all directions. That is, boom, there it is. Since the aim of Dharma is simply to tame ego clinging, as you practice Dharma, ego clinging should decrease. He continues, if your efforts in Dharma do not counteract ego clinging, your practice is meaningless. He's a fairly blunt guy. If your efforts in Dharma do not counteract ego clinging, your practice is meaningless. Since this is the one criteria that determines whether Dharma practice is effective or not, it is said to be the yardstick by which a Dharma person is measured, if there's such a thing as a Dharma person. Now, a lot, of course, spreads out from that. If our one thing we're looking at is our ego clinging, is it decreasing? How do we know if our ego clinging is decreasing? And part of it we can pay attention to, how often are we thinking of others rather than ourselves? Another way is looking at our suffering, because Buddhism really is about ending suffering. Are we as irritable as we had been before? Do we get frustrated as easily? Do we worry as much as we did? Is a part of letting go of taming the ego, of letting go of ego clinging. I just want to say one word about Pema. She has a chapter that is called Loving Kindness and Compassion, or chapter 14, which is about this point. But earlier on in the book, she is equally direct. Another slogan, she says, this is back when she's discussing when the world is filled with evil, transform all mishaps into the path. Another slogan says, all dharmas agree at one point. No matter what the teachings are, shamatha vipassana instruction, lojong instruction, any instruction of sanity and health from any tradition of wisdom, the point at which they all agree is to let go of holding on to yourself. Pum. Also pretty direct. I'm going to read a bit more from Trelig here. Those of you who read him know he does expand a bit more than some of the others do. And then there's Alan Wallace, for those that enjoy Alan Wallace, who really expands. But in this chapter, he says, the goal of all the Buddhist teachings is to overcome our state of ignorance. It's another way of putting this. The ignorance, the state of ignorance, is the belief in the separate self. That it's real, that it's solid, that it's permanent, that it is different from and separate from other things. That's the ignorance. Our delusions obstruct our vision so that we draw all kinds of spurious conclusions from our experiences and cause ourselves immeasurable suffering. So he's connecting all these things too. We have our ignorance of our true selves. We have the delusions that arise from that cause suffering. The main component of our delusory mental states is our egoistic preoccupation. The more we fixate on our experiences from that perspective, the more unmanageable our delusory mental states become. Then he uses depression as an example. The more depressed our mood, the more we indulge in all kinds of projections onto other people, convincing ourselves that nobody really cares about us. And although you may or may not have had a serious major depressive episode, you know what he's talking about, even in those relatively minor times of, oh, this is terrible. We paint with this broad brush of darkness when we're in that dark mood. Nothing is right. I can never do anything right. All these things that are, easily challenged. Of course you can do some things right. No, it's not always, but we paint it with this big brush. And that's a part of what he's saying here. Our self-obsession fans our negative emotions and compels us to obsess over our inner turmoil until we're incapable of seeing anything clearly. All the Buddhist schools agree that the source of our ignorance comes from our conviction that there is a self-sufficient, discrete self and a substantial, immutable other. The conviction of a self, the conviction in a self, comes from thinking we possess some kind of psychic substance, and the conviction in phenomena comes from thinking that things have inherent existence. According to all Buddhist teachings, without exception, these mistaken beliefs cause us to wander aimlessly in a distorted and improbable world. The single purpose of this slogan is therefore to reduce our delusory mental states through meditation and realize selflessness. And one more little piece from him here. He continues talking at some length, actually, about the belief in a self. All Buddhist teachings have the same purpose: to put an end to ignorance by realizing there is no such thing as a self-sufficient, permanent, substantial self or other in phenomenal existence. We hear this over and over again, and yet it sure seems not to be like that. I mean, here I am, here you are, all that kind of interactions that we have. But even our own observations can show us that all the thoughts and feelings and experiences we have around each other are influenced by all the others around us. We are different because of that. They are different because of this. This is because that is because this happened. And we begin to see that there's this dance going on. And everything we're thinking of as a thing is not a thing. It's an interacting part of this dance. So that there's no permanent substantial self or other in phenomenal existence. As long as we entertain the belief in this poorly constructed falsehood, not to mince words, we'll be immured in a state of suffering as soon as we develop an appreciation of the non-duality of subject and object. As soon as we develop an appreciation of the non-duality of subject and object, appearance and reality, deluded consciousness and wisdom consciousness, we'll start to gain a proper insight into our true condition. Non-duality of subject and object. Non-duality of appearance and reality. Non-duality of the apparent separateness and yet the lack thereof. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. They are not separate. We don't try to get rid of one. Even deluded consciousness and wisdom consciousness. Non-dual. We'll start to gain a proper insight into our true condition. That insight is the purpose of all the Buddha's teachings, because it leads to liberation. The way that this slogan helps us to appraise the success of our mind is by assessing how well we are able to relinquish our egoistic preoccupations. Right back there again. You can get pretty tangled. Am I seeing things in a dualistic way, a non-dualistic way? Am I shifting over? Is it 80-20? Well, you can get all tangled if you want to. But assessing how well we're able to relinquish our egoistic preoccupation, we all have a clue about that. We know when we're caught up and we know when we're not. And we can see the shifts and changes. And it's sometimes fun to look back as you experience something that used to just really get under your skin, and suddenly you realize, it doesn't bother me at all anymore. I just see it, it goes, it's nothing. You can see the change. How are we doing time-wise here? I think I'll stop there. There are a number of people this evening, and I sure want to have time to be able to share. So let me stop the recording of this evening of July 20th, 2022, just for the record.